it's now my pleasure to open it to all of the people here for questions. Gentleman who was a member of the public in the dialogue process. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, sir. Forgive me.
I'd like to make a couple of suggestions, actually, just very quickly. And that is that your bullet point presentation there was far better, right, than what is in the actual report. Because I didn't think when I didn't think actually when I first read the report, I only see it today, that it was very reflective actually of the workshops in what was said. So, but when your bullet point presentation was done, I thought it was very good, and it did reflect mostly what was said in the workshops. I believe that one of the problems is if you're on page 20 of the report, that there was not enough consultation on community engagement, and I believe it should be opened further. And I think that, as you say, the next steps forward are very important. And I agree with the re-engagement because I think that a lot of people would like to be re-engaged in this and maybe reflect on what they've said, and you know, as I say, with a sense of responsibility. And I would like to say that I'd like to suggest a leap in the dark actually for some people, because I believe that a panel made up of the public and chaired by a member of the public would be a good idea, rather than it being led by, shall we say, an organisation or a scientist or some kind of professional person. I do believe that somebody was saying there that the public are very astute, and I think they should be given the chance actually to engage in this way. And that's what I was.
Thank you very much. You've raised quite a lot of really interesting points. I mean, first of all, I think that the very knotty one of how any report always reflects exactly what takes place, and I think maybe we should address that for a bit, because it is quite relevant. It's pretty tricky, I think, invariably writing these sorts of reports. So I guess we ought to ask Darren to respond to that, and then maybe Brian. And then the other issue, I think, which is of particular importance, and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing and correct me if I've gotten you wrong, the issue about having a panel which is a public panel to oversee these sorts of developments in some way. I think that would be an interesting thing. We might ask our Research Council representatives. So Darren, may I start with you?
Sure. I apologise for my writing style as well. How we analysed this stuff is that we recorded all of your groups. We then got verbatim transcripts of that, so we had we sent those recordings away and got typed up. Then members of my team who are here and others went through that, and they what's called charted. So they took all these little conversations and they distilled out the key points from that. Those then all merged and looked at in different ways, and that became the basis of the presentation and then the report. I worked with 8 members of the public as well. We couldn't obviously invite everyone back to help draft the conclusions, but we took 2 from each area. I think Janine, who's here, sat in on that group. And I took them through some of the emerging findings and some things we might begin to think about in terms of conclusions as well, and they fed back into that process as well. I mean, obviously, an individual member wouldn't have got the flavour of all of the discussions in all of the areas. So we are generally pretty meticulous about going through stuff, and then absolutely, as Robert mentioned, there is an editorial role there to a degree. But we try to look where themes have emerged across a number of different areas in slightly different ways and push that into one place.
I mean, it's pretty difficult, isn't it, to submit a draft report for approval in this sort of process, because there are too many people involved. I mean, in a research council, I guess we might do that, where we've got a much narrower group of people, but when you've got a bigger body, I think it really wouldn't be feasible. Brian, do you want to add anything?
No, not much, other than I was really fascinated, as somebody whose responsibility is really extended to getting the process underway and maintaining the momentum. It was fascinating to me to watch how these issues unpacked in the workshops. I was very privileged to be able to be along at 2 workshops in 2 different locations, and I was absolutely fascinated by how people from really quite different backgrounds were coming up with the same issues time and again. And I would echo what Dave said about the sophistication of much of the debate that was going on. I mean, this myth about the public not being able to understand how science works and what science is all about is exactly that. It's a myth. I mean, one thing came through very strongly, that people did seem to know how science went on, and they did seem to know, almost intuitively, the kind of issues that go on in the background within science and how science interfaces with the public. So it was fascinating watching that process unfold. And I think Darren's report certainly captures a lot of the stuff that I experienced personally in those workshops. But obviously I wasn't at all of them, so I don't know what it was like in the round. But it was certainly reflected a lot of what I heard.
And what about, maybe we could hear from our two CEOs from the Research Council about the issue of public panels. I mean, it's something that we've obviously talked about in various deliberations at various times. Dave, do you have any views about that?
I mean, obviously there are some areas, established areas of science, particularly on the clinical side, where that sort of thing happens already, particularly obviously in discussion of the ethical issues of medical research. And that's part of the discussion that we've got to have during the summer to find out how we are going to continue this. It is slightly more difficult in a new and very broad area like synthetic biology, which hasn't yet sort of frozen into particular research themes. We held a previous dialogue in the nanotechnology area, which is a little bit more developed, and in fact it was narrowed into specific grand challenge areas. And there we were able to see how, in fact, we should get the public engaged in looking at one more specific set of choices in the nanotechnology area. At the moment, I find it difficult to see how I would use a panel of the general public to look across the whole of this remit, because we haven't even defined the space that synthetic biology occupies. But there will quite soon, I'm sure, come out from the research councils some specific programs, some grand challenges, some thematic areas that it wants to encourage research in. And I think we then need to find out how we're going to engage the public in looking at that sub-element, or that part of the whole research spectrum.
I mean, Doug, it's something in the biomedical area we do, after all, to a very considerable extent with ethics committees, don't we? And I mean, perhaps there's now a move towards that sort of thinking about some of the more, if you like, scientific areas rather than purely medical applications. I guess from the BPSRC you might have some views about that.
Well, it's something that's happened in the past, and it's something we will certainly consider. As I say, we have a panel, our Biosciences for Society panel, that develops our strategy in this area, and they will be doing that very thing. There's lots and lots of interesting questions that one could ask of them. I'll just give you one now. If you had the choice or the ability to make a microbe that would eat oil when oxygen is present and not when it isn't, and you could throw it into the Gulf of Mexico to do a clean-up, would you do it? That's a very real question, which people can ask and answer. At the moment, you can't. You have to rely on natural ones, which work actually quite well. But in the future, people have largely been talking about producing oil with algae and things like this, but clearly in the current climate there's an occasion to do the opposite, which many people might think would be a pretty good idea. But, there's so many possible issues, not only medical but biological and ethical in general terms, that we'd want to think about it quite broadly, and that's what we have a panel to do.
Next question. Are you happy with the answers you've got? Not quite. Well, I mean, no, but if you would briefly, by all means, say so we can think what you're saying and hear what you're saying.
Yes, I think you seem to be a bit negative, too negative about public engagement, actually. And I mean, I in the sense of panels, because I do believe that I think there are some people who could. Maybe they wouldn't be scientists and they wouldn't know technical terms or whatever, right? But they would know how to engage the public and themselves. As I say, I think that the 3 workshops that I was on, they were quite good, but at the same time, I think that there could have been more effort put into, and maybe even more funding put into it making them better. I mean, I think that we're getting into promises made by the government, actually, or the new government, on a lot of public consultation and public engagement. I think that, you know, if you started here, it would be fantastic. It would be a good start, although I don't know which one of you would take that leap in the dark, as I said, you know, because it is a bit of a, as I say, a leap in the dark.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now, there's a question at the back there, gentleman with his hand up, and then...
Thank you. Mark Downs, the Society of Biology. Whilst I absolutely agree that the public can come to some very clear views about science and are certainly very capable of understanding it, it does depend on access to the information in the first place. And when you have these sort of workshop groups, you can facilitate that and make sure that that happens. But of course, we all know that we're driven to a large extent by the debate in the media. And I wonder in that context, and picking up on something which was mentioned earlier, whether actually we're not helping ourselves a great deal by using synthetic as a term for this new area, because actually by itself it sounds pretty negative.
Brian.
Thank you, Robert. Well, we use whatever term happens to be there in the language at the time. This area of scientific activity is already labelled synthetic biology. And it's very, very difficult and, in my view, undesirable to try to change it. After all, I do remember a certain nuclear reprocessing facility on the Cumbrian coast that changed names, I think it was 3 times, so that people would try and forget it was there. It didn't work, and it won't work.
No, I think you know these strategies are unwise. There's a lady, I think you were a member of the public, weren't you? You weren't. No.
I am, but I'm not a scientist.
I wasn't sure whether you were involved in the dialogue process originally. I wasn't sure.
No, that's the general point. Actually, all scientists are also members of the public, and in panels.
Well, we're all members of the
speak
public.
As that, so
yeah.
no, but that's the point to be made. No, but the point I wanted to make is regard to this attitude that came from the scientists that they were a small part in something that could be very big. And whilst it's tempting to speculate that that's just the reaction of the synthetic biology community to not be like Venter, I think it's more likely that there is a fear in what is, as we've said, a young and emerging community to be too ego-driven, particularly given the increased need to write impact statements and to report about the more transformative aspects of our research. We're all very cautious about doing that because we're all very fearful about making too bold claims about what we might do. And I think that, for the scientific community, is a very difficult path to tread, because on the one hand you want us to do transformative research, but on the other hand the public might say that this isn't right, or that this is dangerous, or this is risky. And so I wondered what the research councils, or generally the panel, felt about that, particularly given that a lot of synthetic biologists come from the younger scientific academic community.
It seems, in view of his announcement, we should ask David Darpley, shouldn't we? Dave.
I recognise the point you made, and that's why I, in my sort of 5-minute talk, said I think one of the advantages of this dialogue process is that it provides that safe space in which you can explore these questions, because it is difficult if you are in an exciting area. Do you hype it up? Of course, your peers then say, well, this is overhyped, and therefore we'll reject it because it's incorrect. On the other hand, if you play it down, then, as we've seen, you can be criticised because you're not actually expressing the potential benefits and risks of the whole field. So we do need an arena in which we can hold a sensible and safe dialogue, and I think that's precisely what this is about. I don't have a simple answer which will give you the phrase to add to your next grant application. Not yet.
Lady there in the second row. Thank you.
I'm Joyce Tate from the EPSRC Inogen Centre in Edinburgh University, and I congratulate the people who've been involved with this report on what they've done, and I think it's now quite clear that public engagement is now an integral part of the decision-making process about new developments in science. I think clearly we've got much better at this over the past 10 years. I think there's a sea change in how we do it. But I think there are a couple of relevant and important areas that really don't have a very high profile and could take a greater role in the process, and that's questions about innovation and regulation processes, particularly risk regulation, and innovation processes, how products get taken from a scientific idea through to a product that can be developed in the marketplace. And I think no matter how sophisticated we are at the moment about the engagement process, the way we treat these issues in the public dialogue is very simplistic indeed, and I would like to see them brought in a much more sophisticated way with relevant social science expertise involved from those disciplines as well. And not just in the dialogue itself, but in the follow-up process, when you're considering what you do about the dialogue you've just had and how you take decisions based on that dialogue with those other very important questions in mind.
Thank you very much indeed. It's an important question, and I think we can't but put Stephen on the spot a bit, asking him if this is going to be embedded in government as a process.
Okay, just thinking back very slightly. There's no doubt that, we've come a long way. I think policymakers are often viewed as quite, slow, steady types. And I think to have got to where we have on a number of very interesting issues that concern science and technology, to have got to the point where policymakers are going through these processes already is a major step forward. However, if this process is to really become something that adds value, for many years to come, and in areas where we are talking about getting the science out into true products, the innovative step, the taking it forward, the exploitation. If there is something about ScienceWise or some complement program that could be developed that it covers some of those next steps, then we would of course always look at it. We want to offer the best value, the most sort of certain way of ensuring that where science needs to be understood and the thoughts about what the public feel about whether you should go down development route A or B, just as much as they might worry about whether the fundamental science is right or wrong or ethically sound or not. They're equally valid points, and we would want at some point perhaps to look at that, and whether ScienceWise isn't just for the grassroots policymakers, but for the sort of operational end of policy making as well. I think we're open-minded.
I think it's a very important idea, and of course we do have our friends in the audience from ScienceWise. Maybe they might want to comment or put their hands up if they've got something they immediately want to say, but about how they might develop the next step. But I don't know, just sort of sitting back from the initiator of this particular programme, Brian, whether you want to say anything about how you see one might go further with a repeated taste, dipping one's heel further into the water, if you like, of continued dialogue.
Well, I think one essential element of dialogue is continuous debate. And I don't think you can have a kind of rolling debate that rumbles on in the background. But what you can do, I think, is to promote debate about those steps in the development of science and innovation that look as though they're really important. And you need a mechanism to be able to do that. Venter's work, for example, is, some people say he hasn't created life, but nevertheless he has developed a series of techniques that really take synthetic biology into another developmental stage, which is very, very important. Now, the question to my mind is, how do we best stimulate debate about what could come out of that step? And one of the things we can do is to go back to members of the public and say, well, this is what we could perhaps do in the future with this developmental step. How might you use it? How do you think it might be used? How do you think it should be used? And all the sorts of questions that Darren put up on the screen there come to mind. And that would give you more information about making choices as a funding agency or as someone involved in the political process. It gives you that sounding board. And I think that we need to learn better ways of achieving that, perhaps we need, as David said, public panels to which we can turn periodically. And the question is, who should be on those panels? How do we get to them? And to my mind, the easiest way of putting that kind of thing in practice is to use the web, is to use the social networking facilities that have been developed on the web, so that we can capture views in a much more effective and much more interesting way. And so, I think this process of social dialogue is going to develop in the future, especially using the internet.